Imagine a world where you knew that you mattered and you belonged. The people cared about you because we were so darn good at listening to one another, no matter how different we are. That is what Sidewalk Talk is doing by putting listeners on sidewalks all over the world so that we can practice the art of connecting. Join me, founder and director Traci as I interview experts on the fine art of human connection and interview some of our volunteers who've been listening on the sidewalk and even some of the folks that we've listened to. And if you want to volunteer, consider joining us at sidewalk-talk.org. I get to bring you another hero that you've probably never heard of, Dr. Harry Reis. He's out of the University of Rochester. He's a professor of psychology and Dean's Professor in Art Sciences and Engineering. Let me tell you a little bit about him. So his research interests involve social interaction and close relationships. So you get why he's on the podcast, because we're going to learn a lot here. He studies the factors that influence the quantity and closeness of our social interaction and the consequences of different patterns of socializing for our own health and psychological well-being. In his research, subjects keep really detailed records on their own ongoing social interaction, and he tabulates them by computer related to other various factors such as their sex role, health, and emotional well-being. He really is an expert on loneliness, and we talk a bit about loneliness. He gives me some great couples therapy advice. I'm a couples therapist. He's really interested in intimacy, attachment, and emotion regulation, which are my jam. So, of course, I was taking notes madly during this entire conversation. I think you will be too. So, please meet Harry Reis from the University of Rochester in New York. Dr. Harry Reis, I told you before we started talking live here that I'm so excited to get to spend some time with you. You are somebody who's conducted research that I think is at the heart of Sidewalk Talk's mission. So tell us a little bit about you and a little bit of personal background on why you started researching intimacy and loneliness. Take us there.
Okay, well, I grew up in New York City. I was an only child, and the whole time I was in school, I was always profoundly interested in people and how people connected. I've gone back and looked at some of the materials that my mother saved from my childhood, and you can see that I used to keep charts about who was talking to whom and who was friends with whom and how people were connecting with each other, and that was just as a even as a preteen I was doing that kind of thing. So I think that I just had an intrinsic interest in understanding and observing how people connected. But I didn't go to college for that. I went to college for I won't even tell you what I was majoring in, but it was profoundly uninteresting. But there was this thing called the Vietnam War going on at the time. And the way you could avoid being drafted was to be a teacher in a high need subject matter. And so I decided to pursue that. And the way you got teacher training at City College of New York, which is where I went, was to actually take psychology courses. And I discovered the psychology courses were really interesting to me. And then, as it happened, the year I graduated colleges, they had this thing called the draft lottery, where if they would draw birthdays to see which birthdays would get drafted and which birthdays were lucky and would not. And I was one of the lucky ones. So all of a sudden, I didn't have to teach this thing I didn't want to teach. And I said, I'm enjoying all these psychology things. And so I said, okay, let's go to graduate school. And I went to graduate school, and it all sort of flowed naturally out of that. At the time, there was actually very little study of topics like loneliness and connection and intimacy. It was a taboo topic in psychology. And so there was some resistance to it. And It really wasn't until I was established in the field for about 10 years or so that I got to really begin exploring that topic. So, I would say that I'm one of these people who didn't choose his research topic. The research topic chose me.
In some ways, I can imagine that makes it a little more magical at times, yeah?
It certainly does. And it makes me wish I could go back and talk to that pre-adolescent self of mine and give him a few tips.
Hmm. Well, I have to ask now, what would you, knowing what you know about connection, loneliness, and intimacy, what would you tell that pre-adolescent self? I'm so
Oh,
curious.
the absolutely first thing I would tell him is don't worry so much. Other people are just as, concerned about how they're doing as you are. Um, you want to talk to somebody, just talk to them. Don't be afraid. That was in the days when you made dates with people by calling them on the telephone. That strange.
The most nerve-wracking way.
Oh, and it was horrible. It would take me weeks to be able to make the telephone call. And now I feel like saying, "Hey, just pick up the phone and call."
That's sweet.
So,
I love all the lessons we can go back and imagine saying to our younger selves. And I think those younger selves in some ways are still alive in there in a lot of
yeah.
ways.
Well, there was that movie about that. Peggy Sue Got Married, where
Mm-hmm.
he goes back to his high school self,
Yeah,
but he still has everything he knows as an adult. It would be a fascinating exercise.
right. Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm curious, what have been the things in your study around human connection that have most surprised you that you didn't expect when you set out to do the research or when you had a hypothesis in mind?
Well, that's a tough question.
Well,
Um,
should we go easier first? It was the
no,
one that
no.
like stuck out after reading all your research.
Yeah. Well, I would say that the most surprising thing has been um, how difficult the important elements are for many people. So we think we've got a really good sense of what the essential elements of intimacy and avoiding loneliness are. Um, but the hard part is that you can't just say to people, well, here's what you need to do. So just go out and do it. And, then everything will be hunky dory. And I think what we've discovered is that for many, many people, it's darn difficult to do these things. And you can't just say, okay, I'm going to listen better. I'm going to be more open. I'm going to feel more confident when I'm talking to people. You can't just make those things happen spontaneously. They're deeply wired into our histories as individuals, and to make changes in those kinds of things is a really, really challenging enterprise for people.
Mm. You're touching a nerve for me because active listening. So I'm a couples therapist. I didn't say this to you beforehand. So 16 years I've spent with couples, and then my parents were married 6 times. So really, I've been doing it since I was 4. And active listening feels so techniquey, and it's the number one complaint I get from couples. And I realize that, gosh, there's their own attachment style that has to be worked with before they can even employ good listening skills. There's their own ability to regulate their nervous system before they can employ good listening skills. There's their own capacity to have self compassion for themselves and to label and feel their feelings and have confidence about what they're feeling.
But
But that's my high level. You've got like 10 other things that I have blind spots to that I'm not even seeing. So tell me
yeah, but,
more.
but you just pointed out what is probably the biggest problem, and that is that it's what you described. It works, but it's also techniquey. That when you do it techniquey, it doesn't work.
That's right.
The prototypical couples situation is that you teach them a skill in therapy, and the next time there's some big fight, one of them says exactly what the therapist said. Tell me how you feel about that, and then the other person's response is, "Don't go pulling those techniques on me."
Hmm.
It has to be spontaneous. It has to be natural,
Yeah.
and teaching that is the hardest part.
Yeah, I often tell couples it's more of a change of heart than a change of behavior.
Hmm. Right. Well, we've had years of behavior change therapy for couples, and we know pretty definitively that it doesn't work because it's the feelings underneath the behavior that matter and not the behavior itself.
Mm. Okay, I have to ask this then. What couples theory are you most interested in or that sort of gets you excited based on your research you've done?
Um,
Is it EFT then?
EFT, exactly. Oh, yeah, I was just about to say EFT with a heavy dose of attachment theory in it is kind. Although, the new version of acceptance therapy um,
Yep.
kind of appeals
ACT.
to me. Yeah, the ACT program and all that. That idea really appeals to me. Um, I think it hasn't been around quite long enough for us to really feel confident about it, and in particular I'm not sure it works for couples that, um, let's say, have deep underlying disturbances.
Yeah.
But for ordinary middle class couples who are not dealing with severe pathologies, it's a really intriguing idea,
Yeah.
and I really kind of like the model of accepting the other person because that's very close to our ideas about how important validation is in close
Mm,
relationships.
yeah, for sure. So I'm going to dovetail because I could geek out with you on couples therapy forever, and then everyone would be really annoyed and go, "You didn't ask Harry this and this and this and this." I'm like, "I'm sorry." So can you take me back? Loneliness is getting a lot of airtime right now in the
Sure is.
media. And I feel like there's not a concrete sort of universal definition that maybe touches cross-culturally, that really speaks to the human condition. So I get that you're going to take your stab at it, but you've done a lot more research. It's not something that's just a pop psychology topic for you. What is loneliness for us human animals? What is this thing?
Well, we've got a definition, but it's not an entirely satisfying definition, so I understand where you're coming from. The definition that we use is people feel lonely when the social relations they have fall short of their expectations. When they're seeking a certain level of connection and they feel like they don't have it. Um, what's important about that definition is it makes loneliness different than isolation, because isolation doesn't have to produce loneliness. Um, what's dissatisfying about that definition, of course, is it doesn't say anything about where loneliness comes from. It's more descriptive than it is proscriptive.
Where does it come from in your mind?
Well, in the model I use, it comes primarily from three different kinds of places. The first and the simplest one is that people's social connections just aren't full of meaningful interactions. They're not full of intimacy in our terminology. They may be with other people, but the with other people that they're doing is not satisfying. It's superficial. It doesn't allow them to feel like their inner selves are being reached, and it doesn't give them a sense that they really belong to a group of people. So that's one thing. The
Yep.
second thing is more of what we call social cognition. It's the way people think about their social connections.
Mm,
And basically, what lonely people do is that they think of their social connections as a sign of their inadequacy. That is, when they're trying to make sense of what's going wrong, they they blame themselves. They say, I don't know how to be around people. My skills are inadequate. I don't know how to talk to people. But curiously, at the same time, they're very critical. So and we've done several studies where we've shown that lonely people are more critical of others, and they're particularly critical of people they're close to, which, of course, you can see how that would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you're critical of
right.
other people, then they don't want to connect with you. And the third category we look at is more characterological kinds of problems. There are a bunch of correlates that go along with loneliness that are very well established. Insecure attachment, as you undoubtedly know, low self-esteem, neuroticism, um, just a feeling of the self not being desirable, that other people don't want to connect with you, that sort of puts you behind the eight ball even before you begin to interact with other people.
Mm.
So it's that set of three things, and I haven't personally haven't done any intervention work trying to deal with this, but what I know of the intervention literature suggests that you really have to work on all three at once.
Mm.
Um, that when I was first starting in this area of research in the 1980s, it was really popular to teach lonely people social skills.
Yep.
So to teach them how to initiate, teach them how to appropriately self-disclose, teach them how to be active listeners, and that approach never did much. And I really do believe it's because it didn't address the sort of underlying cognitions that people had about their loneliness, and it didn't address the character problems that lonely people tend to
Yeah, so well said. And it definitely mirrors some of my experience on the sidewalk too. As we listen on sidewalks, there were so many different genesis points for us, and loneliness wasn't the first implication. Some of it was also an uptick in violence in our culture and me personally, trying to make sense of that. But everything I've seen has really proven what you're espousing, which is listening alone isn't enough, right?
have. Right.
That there are folks that will come and sit down or participate, and if they have these characterological components to themselves where their self-esteem is low, or they feel themselves not to be desirable, or they're really negative, you can see how that sense of listening as part of a community doesn't scratch their itch of loneliness. They're still feeling it because there are these other ingredients. I'm really with you on that. It makes sense to me. And there's a part of me that still wants to win and wants to figure out a way to solve it, right? But I guess
Oh,
that's what I'm
sure.
doing as
I
a
mean,
therapist, right?
and I would love it if it was as simple as skills. There's one group of people for whom skills training does seem to be helpful,
Mm,
and that's high functioning autism. Um,
yes.
I'm always struck. I teach a class on relationships here at the University of Rochester, and there are always a couple of high functioning autism kids in the class, and they're in the class because they want to learn the rules.
Mm,
But interestingly enough, for them, they tend to be fairly well put together, and they don't have the character problems. And if you teach them the rules, they go out and they use them.
yeah.
And it really does seem. My brother-in-law is actually in that category, and when you explain things to him that he should wait 3 seconds before when someone else stops talking before he starts talking, and he applies that rule, and it's helpful to him.
Yeah. Well, so can we think together a little bit then about this quality of loneliness? Do you believe that it's getting worse, or are we simply tracking it more now?
Yeah,
And that's why we're talking about it.
right. That's such an interesting question. All of the data I've seen, including data that I've collected in my class over the 35 years that I've been teaching this class, say that there was a sudden spike in loneliness about 6 to 8 years ago, let's say, in the late adolescent, early adult generation. I'm normally suspicious of data like that because interpreting time trends in data is really, really complicated. But the suddenness of the spike was really striking. And not coincidentally, the spike happened at the same time that all of a sudden people became married to their cell phones.
Hmm.
And colleague Jean Twenge in California has data showing that the spike in loneliness happened precisely among the people who use their cell phones the most.
Yeah.
So I have to believe that the spike is not a coincidence. That in fact loneliness is increasing. I don't exactly want to blame cell phones for that because I think that it's a lot more complicated. But maybe the right
Hmm.
way to think about it is to think that what our cell phones do is they make it too easy to fulfill the itch in an unsatisfying way.
Yeah.
I like to think about cell phones as fast food.
Yep.
You know, if you're hungry and you go get yourself a Big Mac, you won't be hungry, at least for a little while. But what you're eating is not nutritious.
Hmm.
So it's not really meeting your need to eat nutritious food, but it is solving that immediate hunger. And I think that the kinds of connections we often make through our devices may have the same kind of functions. If you're feeling like you need a connection or you want to talk to this family member or this friend, it fulfills that itch for a moment, but it doesn't produce the kind of satisfying social interaction that makes people feel deeply valued and connected with other people over time.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and then there's this trickle out effect, which is the more that we start living off of fast food, right? Then there's a longer term impact. I think about, for example, as our lives become busier, we also don't make time for meaningful connection. Or as many of us are perhaps having an idea of what marriage is and don't recognize that it also involves having hard conversations. It's not just romance, right? There's this quality in which we're increasingly disincentivized to invest in intimacy, period. And it seems to sort of snowball on itself. Like once you start eating this food, you just keep eating this food. And I keep wondering about all the other systemic inputs that produce that, right? As the economy gets worse and families have less time to spend together, um, all of the different inputs, right?
oh,
When,
absolutely, absolutely. You know, one of the fascinating things about marriage in the modern world is, you know, most people will tell you that the most important thing in their life is their family. Not, you know, maybe not everybody, but certainly if you do studies where you ask people what's important to you, family and friends invariably comes out at the top for 75 to 80% of people. Isn't it interesting that we tend to spend our time on the most important thing in life, usually around 11:30 at night when we're exhausted and have very little mental resources left?
yeah.
Um, you know, there's something backwards about
And I have to say that with all the couples that I'm seeing right now, while some of them are strained, others are actually doing better because of that fact.
that. Oh yeah,
They're
I
like,
think.
oh my God, the reduction in running kids from here to there has already made a massive improvement in for the couples that didn't have really anything characterological going on between the two of them, they're doing really well right now under quarantine. And it's been fascinating because it proves out really what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna see a spike in divorces when quarantine is
Sure.
over. But I also think that there's a spike in couples who kind of rediscovered each other
Yeah.
and rediscovered the joy of cooking together and having a meal together. And you know, and one of the things that I think is important about our work on intimacy is, by the way, I don't want people to get the idea that we're saying that the way to avoid loneliness is to have deep, meaningful conversations all the time. That's
Hmm.
not what we're saying
Yay!
at
I'm
all.
so glad to hear that. Say
Yeah.
more.
Well, there's, you know, I mean, sometimes you need to have a deep, meaningful conversation,
Sure.
of course, but a lot of what produces meaningful connection is simply sitting around and laughing with people and talking about politics and talking about how your day went, and just just being there, just being in the presence of another person in a warm, thoughtful way, in a mindful way, if you want to use that word, going to the movies together, playing a game together, just being together in a way that people feel connected to each other is every bit as important as having those deep, meaningful conversations.
Gosh, I couldn't agree more. And I hope that what we do when we're out there sitting on the sidewalk is we wet people's whistle because I
Yeah,
swear to God, I feel like people forget what you're saying.
yeah. Well,
A,
yeah,
they forget that it's an intention. It's not a technique. It's an intention. I'm going to show up and just be with you here. I'm not going to do anything to you. I'm not going to fix you. I'm not going to give you advice. I'm just going to be here in this particular way where I'm open to kind of pulling at the little thread and seeing where the how the ball of yarn unravels.
yeah.
And I we just don't prioritize that at all because there's nothing about it that's productive.
Well, well,
you
it's,
know?
it's worse than that, Tracy. Think about what happens when couples get married and have a child. Now,
Mm,
here been dating, so they've been doing things together, right? They go out
mm,
together, they do things together. Then they have a child, and they don't want to pay for babysitters all the time. So you go out on Monday night, and I'll go out on Tuesday night. So all of a sudden, all those fun things that they used to do together, you can go skiing this weekend, and then I'll go skiing next weekend.
mhm.
And all those things that they used to do together that were a way that they produced a sense of togetherness, all of a sudden now they're doing what we call parallel play.
Mm,
And, then 10 years later, all of a sudden they wonder what happened.
yeah.
So one of the really simplest recommendations you can make to couples who are struggling is the concept of date night.
I
Uh,
do date night, but you know what I do? I tell them to go on a double date initially
yeah,
because
that's great.
sometimes you get a couple that goes out together that hasn't been talking to each other for 10 years and they come back freaked out. They're like, "We didn't have anything to talk about." So I'm like, "Go on a double date."
Yeah, I
Cuz your
like that.
partner will start talking to somebody else and they'll start talking about things that you guys would have never talked about together. Moreover, you're going to get to see a side of them that's novel and you're going to want to go home and have sex with
Right. Well, and in fact, you used the word novel, and another variant of that, which my dear friend and colleague Art Aaron has been promoting for a long time, is to do novel and exciting activities together. So
them.
rather than just doing date night, take a course together, take a photography
Love
course,
that.
take a cooking course, do something, focus on an activity, something that both people want to do that will require them learning a new skill, working together at something or other. And that can sometimes overcome the awkwardness that you're mentioning, um, just by having them have some activity they can focus on.
I love that. I love that. That's really cool. Yeah. Oh my God, I want to talk to you forever, just forever and ever, and keep going. But I know we just have just a little bit more time left. But I'm hoping that you'll come back, and I'm
Sure.
hoping that we'll be able to sort of geek out on ways that we could have an impact on this. So I wanted to ask you one more thing around listening, because I agree with you. Even though we're a listening project, how can though there be a positive outcome where listening does begin to move the needle, even sort of tangentially around this loneliness piece? And what would need to be involved beyond the usual reflections and blah 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 that you get in active listening for it to really make a shift for someone?
Well, I think that what has to happen is that people have to do it, and they have to do it sincerely, and they have to do it for an extended period of time. So a lot of people, when they do active listening, they're sitting there counting the seconds before it's their turn to talk, and that's not active listening. But when you really pay attention to what another person is saying, then you can get insight into them, and interestingly enough, that makes it easier for people to feel like the other person is actually paying attention to them. So,
Mm.
sometimes I'm reminded of the old Groucho Marx joke about the important thing is to be sincere, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. Um,
Oh
but
God.
with active listening, if you're faking it, it's not going to work. But
That's right.
if you can really focus on the paying attention to what the other person's saying and then responding to it,
Mm.
when that goes back and forth for a while, I think eventually it does feed back into some of these other issues that we've been discussing.
Mm.
So, it's not, do it for 5 minutes and all of a sudden it's going to work
Yeah.
fine, but to really pay attention to it. I think one thing that'll happen is if you do it sincerely, you'll see the reaction in the other person,
Yeah.
and you'll have this thought, hey, they're actually they're actually pleased with how I'm responding. They're
Yeah.
listening. They feel like I have some useful input, and so I think they're. I think it takes time and practice. Is really
Yeah. Yeah.
saying.
Yeah. And I think so often we technique it in a way that it doesn't feel sincere. And then people aren't motivated to practice because I always think we always have to find, as Terry Real says, the leverage or the source of motivation so that the person is interested in continuing to go rather than it, to keep going with the practice rather than it just being about something someone told you to do.
Right,
And I always tell couples, I said, just do it until it feels good.
right,
If it doesn't, if it feels techniquey, you haven't got it yet. It's got to feel damn good when you do
right.
it. And when
Also,
it starts to feel really good, then you're onto something.
right, but of course, sometimes it starts to feel worse and worse,
Yeah.
and that's when couples are really in trouble.
That's when they come pay the big bucks and come see me.
Right,
Sorry, I'm not confident about a lot of things, but I'm very confident about my couples therapy skills. So, which feels nice to actually own in a conversation. I can be kind of wimpy about a lot of things, so it's nice to not be wimpy.
that's awesome
All right.
because,
Yeah.
as you know, couples therapy is one of the hardest therapies to do.
I guess because I've been doing it since I was 4, it's not so hard for me. I think that piece of work I always have to do is to make sure I keep my 4-year-old out of the room. But that's why I have my own buns on a therapist couch too, so that I'm not doing that to my couples,
Uh,
right?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So here's how we end. We have a tradition for how we end our conversation, and it's nice because you get to take the floor. So, if you were to speak directly to these 7,800 listeners now that listen across 15 countries, either you get to choose either a piece of advice or you want to send them a wish. This is your chance to speak directly to them. What would you want to say?
Oh, that's one I need a half hour to think through. Um,
Oh,
I would say that I would offer a wish for everybody that they could find a group of people with whom they feel really connected to, that they feel that these are their people,
mm,
people who you feel are on the same wavelength with you, people who you feel see the world in the same way that you do, and people that you can actually spend time with, so that you feel immersed in a network, that you could even call a family, but it's a chosen family, and that you could grow old with those people. That would be my
mm.
wish.
I love that wish. I love that wish. Dr. Rice, Dr. Reese. I always want to say Rice,
Well,
we talk about you a lot, Guy and I. He goes, it's Reese, Traci, it's Reese, and I'm like,
well,
okay.
well, you're not wrong. There is an old family story about that. So, if you have time, I'll tell you the family story.
Tell me the story.
Oh, it's a
If
wonderful
you,
story.
it's
The,
tell me
the
the story.
it's My family's German, and the proper German pronunciation is Reis.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, some generations back, there were two brothers who did not get along well.
Oh, you're
And
kidding me.
one of them, yes, in order to distance himself from his other brother so that people wouldn't think they were the same family, changed the pronunciation of the name to Reis. And
You are kidding me.
I'm descended from that person.
Wow.
And my family, being a family that has always been good at holding grudges, the story makes perfectly good sense to me. So it became Reis, even though the proper German pronunciation is in fact Reis.
That's why I keep, because I don't know if you know this, but I'm in Germany right now while we're
Oh,
having our discussion. I'm living in Heidelberg, so I'm married to
you're
a
kidding.
German. No.
Heidelberg is where those two brothers live.
Oh my gosh. Should I go drive over to their house?
Um, the house is still there. I've been to the house.
No
You,
kidding.
you know where it's not the city hall. There's a city information bureau right by the Neckar River.
Yeah,
Their
totally.
house is one of the houses right next to that.
Oh wow. That's
I
too
don't. I
much.
would tell you the address, but I don't know it.
Well, we'll have to do that offline. That's
Oh,
great.
Heidelberg. I love Heidelberg. Such a beautiful little
It's really nice. It's
town.
nice. Oh, I so appreciate having this conversation. So, thank you so much, Dr. Reis. And for everyone that's listening, we will put more information about different articles and resources from Dr. Reis's research in the show notes. And we hope that we'll have him back sometime in some capacity. We're not sure yet, but I hope this is just the beginning. And thank you for the work that you do in the world.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Take good care.
You too. Bye bye now.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of the Sidewalk Talk podcast. If you like what you heard, tell your friends, tell your family, like and comment on the podcast publisher that you're listening from, and subscribe. This will help us get the word out about changing our culture to one